This is a really good plot. Narrative. Wait, what's the difference between plot and narrative? Is the text the same as the plot? Is narrative different? What's the story? Oh my god, what's happening? So today we're going to look at narrative. Narrative is a really important thing when you're looking at a text, but a lot of us don't understand the difference between things like narrative, story, and plot. So let me explain. So the first thing to realise is that obviously narrative isn't the most exciting of topics, but it's really crucial for understanding how we can read and understand a text. So in the interest of making it a bit more lively, okay, so now we've got that out of the way, what is narrative? So the first thing to remember is that every text is made up of two things, story and plot, which now when I think about it, sounds a bit like an 80s sitcom. So what is story, I hear you ask? Good question. Story is basically what happens. So I woke up like this. It's an event or a sequence of events. I woke up like this because I'm a bad who spent last night in the club. Plot is how the story is presented in the narrative. In the example here, the I is the same person, and there's a link between waking up like this and being at the club last night. The words in the sentence give us gradually more information, the plot, while what lies underneath is what corresponds to the story. So looking at this sentence, we can either read that the person woke up looking great and did so because they're the type of person who can get smashed and wake up feeling fresh the next day, or that they woke up with a hangover, they feel rough and they're really regretting it. So there's two stories here. One, feeling fresh. Two, not so fresh. Sometimes you can have two different sentences that can be read in the same way. That would be having two plots, the surface, with one story, what's underneath. Think about this. I got drunk, so I've got a sore head, versus my head is pounding because of that last pint. Both of these sentences have different structures, the plot, but relate to having a headache, the same story. Whilst we derive story from plot, we need the narrative to organise the idea. So let's think about the different kinds of narratives. You might think about seeing a different story told in multiple forms. Each of these might utilise different narratives to tell the story and organise the plot. Let's look at Harry Potter, for example. So whilst the story may pretty much be the same, the form in which it's told can be radically different. We have the books, films, plays, even fan fiction. Because of these different organising principles, you might find there are elements from the book that you don't see in the film, and vice versa. This is because the narrative form may not allow for it. So, when, spoiler alert, Voldemort dies in the film, we have a slow motion crumbling into air type affair, when in the book he just dies. This is because the story is rooted around the idea of power and the way that Voldemort's power, which is seen for so long throughout the books as being unstoppable, is shown in the end to not be that big a deal after all. The film, however, utilises a visual medium, so that wouldn't look very dramatic or exciting. So instead, we have Voldemort turning into dandruff and floating away never to be seen again. We see this kind of thing all the time, particularly with book-to-film adaptations, because so much is cut out for length. There are whole threads online about what was cut from books, which totally changes the plot, and a lot of people think this detracts from the story. Also, oh no, if you think that was a spoiler, you've probably been asleep for the last 20 years. But anyway, going back to plot, there may be some archetypes that you're already familiar with. Good versus evil, the mismatched couple, this doesn't have to be romantic, the hero leaving the village to go on the quest, and so on. We see these plot points time and time again because they're so enduring and familiar to us. Equally, we might tie these to certain character types as well. We've got the hero and the villain, Voldemort and Harry, but we might also have the buddy who joins us on the quest. And then there's the odd couple who are comprised of polar opposites. The whole setup of Schitt's Creek is that the formerly rich family are now broke and have to deal with living with regular people. There might also be ways that narrative is organised and be recognisable through links to genre. For example, the odd couple trope is used a lot in comedy because it leads to hilarious consequences. Other examples might be the brooding hunk for romantic ones. If you want to think critically about these these ideas, something to think about in terms of story and plot is who is being represented by whom. So do certain characters always seem to die, maybe black and gay people, or are they limited in their roles in some way? Black and gay people. So how is the relationship between story and plot shown through narrative? One way of doing this is through the use of time. Usually time is presented in what's called a linear narrative. This runs from start to finish without being interrupted. Non-linear is what you get when things are all jumbled up. A great example of this is the film Memento, which is told back to front, where the first season of Westworld, although no one knew which narrative was happening at any given point, which is an extreme example, it served an important narrative purpose though. It showed us the way that systems can be controlled to make us behave in particular ways. What Westworld also demonstrates is the difference between text and story time. Whilst watching the show, you might think you're watching something as it happens, but it's actually relating to a larger story that takes place across multiple timelines. Each strand eventually added up to the completion of the story, but at the same time they also sort of worked independently of one another. If that doesn't make much sense, well, nor does the show really, but basically think about reading a book. This may take a certain amount of time to read, say a couple of hours, whilst covering a certain period of time, a day or two. The overall story though may be over a much greater period again, perhaps decades. One way that narrative time can be played around with is the use of flashback. There can be multiple flashbacks used throughout, where the main plot might be one big flashback, where we see a text start at the end, loop back, and then end up back where it started. There are all sorts of ways narrative can play around with story and plot. Plot of each story is relayed to us through narration by a narrator. They are always there, but it may be less apparent to us. There's first person narration, so I did this. Second person, you did this. Third person, they did this. And some argue there's actually a fourth, one did this, but I personally think it's an extension of the third person. Focalization is tied to the visual, so in a film you might have a director who has a particular style like Wes Anderson. He loves brown and orange hues, placing characters symmetrically in a frame, and so on. Any text has an author and a reader, but there are actually two of each. We have the actual author and actual reader, and the implied author and implied reader. When the author of a text writes it, they can't know about the reader. And when we read a text, we can't know the actual author. We just recognize the implied author through the constructed narrative. A good example of this would be a text called A Modest Proposal, which is a really famous piece of satire. The implied author of the piece told the implied reader that to save society, one should eat children. Now, the real author of the text, Jonathan Swift, didn't believe in cannibalism, and equally, the real reader didn't want to eat children. The effect of the story was for the real reader to distance themselves from the implied reader, the one who's being encouraged to eat babies. Basically, we can think of a text as being in the middle of the actual reader and the actual author, and containing a bunch of different constructions. One of the most famous examples of the inaccessibility of the real author is written by Roland Barthes. In it, he says that the real author is never fully accessible through the text, and can therefore never be understood, because we can only look at what the text contains. But what about famous authors we know all about? Well, you may know a lot about an author, but remember they aren't the same as the implied author within the text. It's also worth remembering you can't physically jump into the mind of an author and know exactly what they meant at any given time. This is also why people can jump to conclusions. They might read a poem by someone who died and say the poem is about this, when obviously it's impossible for a dead person to write a poem, I think. So now we know what narrative is. What about narratives within narratives? Well, these are called meta-narratives. You might be reading a book or watching a film that starts with the narrator telling a story, and that story then becomes the main narrative. It's like we've gone down a level, Inception style, in the narrative consciousness. This happens in all sorts of books, like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Shelley's Frankenstein, or, well, frankly, Inception. To recap, we have a story and a plot given to us through narration that all work together within a text. Story is derived from what happens, i.e. the plot, and the narration organises the plot so we can understand the story. Okay, thanks for watching. Remember to let me know if there's any topics you'd like me to cover, and to like, comment and subscribe below. See you later.